All right. Welcome back to the Discipline File series. All right. This is powered by me, Coach UV, the Unique Trading Group. And here's where strategy meets mindset and discipline turns into income. In this episode, we're going to be diving deep into what it really means to think like a professional trader. All right. That's what we are here for. If you've been following along, you know in part 5, we've explored a true trader's nature. That moment when you find your edge, you execute flawlessly, and begin tapping into potential of unlimited wealth. But as we learned from Mark Douglas himself, it's not the market that holds us back. It's our own self-sabotaging beliefs that keep us from true consistency. All right? The consistency you're looking for is not on the charts. It's inside your mind. He reminds us that once you truly understand, you do not need to know what's going to happen on any single trade to make money. That's when you've got it. That's when everything starts to click, to be quite honest. So today in part 6, we're continuing that conversation. We're taking that idea of consistency, discipline, and mindset and pushing it one step deeper. Now, if you're just catching this video on the fly, I highly recommend going back and watching part 1 so you can really experience the full journey. But if you've been rocking with me from the beginning, thank you. Truly, your commitment to understanding the deeper side of trading is what this channel is all about. I really appreciate you guys' time, and in return, I want to continuously to give you guys value. So this space is for anybody who knows there's something more, there's something missing, right? Something beneath the charts, the screens, the trades themselves. So grab your notebook, take some notes, give yourself some grace, and remember this content was always here for you, but whenever you need to come back and soak it in, it'll be here again and again. All right, so we'll be right back with this commentary from Mark Douglas. All right, thinking like a professional trader, right after this break.
And that when you stop believing that, you will start making consistent money. Because it's your expectations about this trade winning that's going to mess you up. Go ahead.
What you're really saying is you have to have a belief in your plan or your methodology, and you're looking for a probabilistic result, saying over a period of time I will execute 60, 70, 80% of my trades. The one I'm going into now could be a good one, could be a bad one.
That's right.
I don't care.
That's right. Exactly right. Perfect. Thank you. This is where we're going. Okay? Thinking, assuming, or believing you know what will happen next creates an unrealistic expectation in a specific outcome. What's wrong with an unrealistic expectation? Well, think about, let's say, expectations in relationship to the characteristics of humanity. This cuts across everybody, and cuts across all cultural lines or barriers. Everyone. Well, first of all, before we can get to that point, what is an expectation? An expectation is a mental representation, in other words, a belief, an assumption, or an opinion, or whatever, thinking, assuming, or believing, a mental representation of what the next moment, meaning next moment, next 5 seconds, or the next in 10 seconds, or the next hour, or whatever, is either going to, in the environment. In other words, we have a mental representation, and we have an external environment that expresses itself, okay? So my mental representation, meaning my expectation, if the environment shows up in a way that is consistent with what I believe, then what will my state of mind be? This is a universal characteristic of humanity. This isn't any different with anybody, anywhere. How will I feel? What will be my state of mind? What will be my experience? I'll be in a state of satisfaction, a state of well-being. I could be joyous. I could even end up in a state of euphoria. The degree to which the environment does not express itself in a way that's consistent consistent with the way I think it's either going to look like, sound like, taste like, smell like, or feel like. Okay? I will be in a state of dissatisfaction, a state of betrayal, disgust, anger, fear, terror. Your ability to create consistent results as a trader is all about what you expect. When you change your expectations to be consistent with the way the market environment exists, the fear will go away. When you change your expectations in a way that's consistent with the way the actual market environment exists, your fear will go away. And you'll be able to do exactly what you need to do when you need to do it, without conflict, without hesitation, and be able to close that profit gap between what your methodology will give you and what you end up with in your bottom line. Unrealistic expectations cause us to define and interpret and therefore perceive market information as threatening. Ultimately, we can break the market down to its lowest definable component parts. If we break the market down to its lowest definable component parts, what we end up with is up and down ticks. Okay? An uptick is one incremental price change where the price moved from 1 to 2, from 2 to 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever, and then down ticks. Okay? When we're operating out of unrealistic expectations, we're going to tap into 4 primary trading fears that will cause all the errors that we make as traders. Those fears are the fear of being wrong, losing money, missing out, and leaving money on the table. And those fears will actually cause us to perceive these up and down ticks as threatening. And what we're going to learn about the nature of fear a little later is that fear will cause us to focus on the object of our fear so that we end up creating the very experience we're trying to avoid. Therefore, if I'm afraid of being wrong, I will actually perceive this information in a way that causes me to be wrong. If I'm afraid of losing, I will perceive these up and down ticks in a way that will actually cause me to lose. If I'm afraid of missing out, I'll actually create the experience of missing out. And if I'm afraid of leaving money on the table, that's exactly what I'll end up doing. Now, when you think about the nature of these up and down ticks and the photons that appear on your computer screens, is there an inherent characteristic in that information that's threatening in any way? In other words, is it information? In other words, when we talk about the nature of emotional pain, which is the threat of pain, okay, the fear, not physical pain, where we have all of us have a normal nervous system, and we come into contact with a physical object, if I hit this with my arm, it's going to hurt. If you hit it with your arm, it's going to hurt. So we've got some universal commonality. But with emotional pain, it's not that way at all. Although we think that it is, it's not. Because emotional pain requires an interpretation. And then interpretation comes from what we believe. You guys with me on this, on the interpretation part? Because, see, the information itself, the up and down ticks, have no charge to them whatsoever. They're not positively or negatively charged. They're just up and down ticks. That, based on your ability to read those up and down ticks, tell you what the potential is for the market to move in any particular direction. If you're perceiving them as threatening in some way, that's definitely going to cause you problems when it comes to creating consistent results. In fact, you're going to find it impossible. Okay, let's talk about some typical trading errors. The typical trading errors the professional has evolved beyond. Don't define the risk in advance of putting on a trade. Why in the world, of all the trading books that you've ever read, out of all the workshops you've probably been to, I'm sure that you have been exposed to this particular piece of advice countless times. And yet, it is the primary trading error that people commit all the time. They don't predefine the risk in advance of putting on a trade. If you don't predefine the risk in advance, you're operating out of the mindset that you think you know what's going to happen next. And what I'm going to establish for you when we get into the next section is that is absolutely not the case. It doesn't mean we don't think that, but the reality is it isn't the case. See, because when we predefine our risk, let's put it this way. If I'm a typical trader operating out of the four fundamental fears, the fear of being wrong, the fear of missing out, losing money, etc., we got a real problem here because our minds are naturally wired to associate. In other words, our minds will automatically make connections. Meaning this, that if I get into a trade and I end up being wrong, I expect it to win and I'm wrong. I have to admit that I'm wrong. It isn't just admitting that I'm wrong on this one trade. Our mind, because the way our minds are wired, it has the potential to tap us into the accumulated negative energy of every time I've been wrong in my life. Okay? So if this circle represents a huge ball of negative energy inside of our mental environment about what it means to be wrong, being wrong on just one trade could tap us into that pain. And it's going to work differently for everybody. Everyone's minds works a little bit differently. But that's the potential. If you wonder why people seem to live and die on the outcome of the next trade, this is one of the reasons why. This is why it's so important. Because it has the potential to tap us into the accumulated negative pain of every time we've been wrong in our lives. Every time we've lost something in our lives. Every time we've missed out on an opportunity that we didn't take advantage of. Every time we've been in an opportunity and didn't get the maximum amount that was available. Those are the four fears. So the problem with predefining our risk is this. Is that if I'm afraid of being wrong, and I don't know how to think about trading appropriately in a probabilistic mindset, I'm not going to get into this trade unless I think I'm right. And the problem with predefining the risk is that it requires that I gather evidence as to why it might not work. Predefining your risk requires that you gather evidence as to why it might not work. Well, I wouldn't even be getting into it in the first place if that were the case. So I'm going to gather as much evidence as possible to make sure that I'm doing the right thing. Because if I start gathering evidence as to why it might not work, then I might talk myself out of taking the trade. And then if I end up talking myself out of taking the trade and it turns out to be a winner, I'll probably be in more emotional pain than what I would have been in had I taken the trade and it turned out to be a loser. So I just make sure that I've got all my ducks in a row and I don't take the trade unless I do. And therefore, what I have done, now think about this, what I have essentially done is define the risk out of the trade. I've gone through a mental process in which I have literally defined the risk out of the trade. Why do I have to put a stop in the market and predefine my risk if I know I'm going to win? A professional trader just doesn't think that way. They would not. I'm not saying that they never thought that way. I'm not saying that they didn't experience the exact same thought process that I just took you through. I'm saying they have evolved beyond it. They would never allow themselves to get into a trade without predefining the risk. In other words, what does the market have to look like, sound like, or feel like to tell me this trade isn't working? The next error, define the risk but don't take the loss, and it turns out to be a bigger loss. That's probably one of those things that never happened to anybody in this room, but just in case someone watches the DVD where this sort of thing has happened, I included it. Same dynamics, basically. Hesitate, get in too late. Why are you going to hesitate? Why are you going to hesitate to get? If the criteria that you use to define an edge is present in this moment, why would you hesitate? Because you don't think the trade's going to work. You have doubt. In other words, you are either thinking, believing, or assuming that you know what's going to happen next. Think of the connection here. You couldn't hesitate unless you either assumed, think, or believed that you know what's going to happen next. If you operate out of the perspective that you don't know what's going to happen next, I don't need to know what's going to happen next to make money, then there's no point in hesitating. Jump the gun. Get in too soon where the signal never actually develops. Coming off of a winning trade. You're going to jump the gun when you come off a winning trade or a series of winning trades, right? And you're just so excited about what you see developing. Yeah, the signal isn't quite there yet. But you know what? Let's get in before everyone else. And you never actually get a signal. That's a trading error. Now see, the point, that doesn't mean that you couldn't win. See, what you're going to find is that when you trade on what I call a trade-by-trade basis, see, we're going to make the distinction between trading trade by trade and trading over a series of trades. When you trade by trade, it means that each individual trade is like a life or death thing. In other words, I wouldn't be putting this trade on if I didn't think this trade was going to win. Not the opposite of that, which is I'm going to put on the next 20 trades because I think that 70 or 75% of them or 50% of them are going to win. There's a huge difference in perspective. So if you're coming off a winning trade or a series of wins, you're likely to jump the gun. But the interesting part about all this is that each one of these errors that I'm giving you could all result in a winning trade. You could do every single one of these things and still win. You could not predefine your risk and still find yourself in a winning trade. You can hesitate and find out it's exactly the right thing to do in that moment. You can jump the gun and find out it's exactly the right thing to do in that moment. You can not take your loss and the market comes back in your favor. All these errors that we're talking about, you can commit over and over again, and they could end up you can end up experiencing positive results. Except one thing is that when you indulge yourself in behaviors, in these kinds of behaviors, it could lead to virtually every time leads to a catastrophic loss. Catastrophic. You put on a trade without predefining your risk 3 or 4 times in a row and turns out to be a winner. And then the next one, you don't do it that's the one that's going to be the catastrophic loss. See, so on a trade-by-trade basis, you can do anything for any reason and commit any error, or what would be considered an error in the perspective of trying to create consistency, and still win and still have winning streaks and still have a lot of fun. But you're setting yourself up for catastrophic losses. Get out of a winning trade too soon and leave money on the table. There isn't a trader alive who hasn't experienced that. Let a winning trade turn into a loser without having taken any profits. All these errors are the result of thinking, assuming, or believing that we know what's going to happen next. Move a stop closer to an entry point, get stopped out, and the market trades back in your favor. In other words, what would that tell you? If you're here, if you buy at this price right here, and you put your stop here, this is all you're really saying is that this is how far I'm going to let the market trade against my position to tell me that this trade is either not working at all, or that the potential for it working is so diminished that it's not worth me staying in any longer. And then the market starts to drift down to your stop, and then you move your stop up and you get stopped out, and then the market does this. What would that tell you about your attitude? What? Yeah, and you hadn't accepted the risk of that trade, did you? See, people can put stops in the market. It doesn't mean they've really accepted the risk. You can put a stop in the market, but it doesn't mean you've genuinely accepted the risk. This would tell me, someone came to me and said, Mark, this is what I did. This is what I know. I know that you didn't accept the risk of that trade, or you wouldn't move the stop.
Move it the other way, too.
What?
Move it the other way.
Yeah, you can move the other way, too, because, that's because you don't want to admit you're wrong. The professional trader is no longer susceptible to these typical trading errors because he's learned to think in probabilities. When you understand the relationship between how prices move and the mathematical formulas and price patterns that make up a trading methodology, quantifies that movement into tradable edges, then why you have to learn the skill of thinking in probabilities will become self-evident. In other words, when we get through the next section, the way you need to think, I want you guys to be at the point where it just becomes completely self-evident as to why you need to think in probabilities to make consistent money. It'll just make sense. It's just like, oh, yeah, okay. This makes absolute sense. The 3 developmental modes of trading. Now, I gave you the broad skill sets that you have to learn to create consistency. Well, within those broad skill sets are within the 3, what I call 3 developmental modes of trading. There's mechanical trading, subjective trading, and intuitive trading. There's 3 stages. In other words, in mechanical, what you want to do is you want to trade with a rigid criteria that defines your edge. All execution decisions are made in advance of market activity. The market either conforms to your definition of an edge or not, and you execute your trades based on a plan. In other words, what you're doing in the mechanical mode of trading is you're limiting the number of variables that you're dealing with in the market. Because what you want to find out is this. You want to find out what works and what doesn't. This is where, to find out what works and what doesn't, you can paper trade. In other words, you can actually take a particular trading strategy and methodology and forward trade it with paper trading, or if you've got software that does the analysis for you, you can do it that way too. But it's better to probably paper trade it so that you're actually interacting with your particular variables that are defining an edge. So you're finding out what works and what doesn't. If you use an unlimited number of variables to define an edge, when you're trading randomly, you never find out what works and what doesn't. So you have to learn that. You have to have confidence in that. But the other part of it too is finding out whether or not your own personal psychology is made up in a way that you can actually execute that edge. And the problem with the execution part of it is that paper trading doesn't cut it. You actually have to have money on the line. And so what you do in the mechanical stage is that you use the mechanical stage as a means to learn trading skills. In other words, your focus is on skills and not necessarily on how much money you're making or not making. Because when you've acquired the appropriate skills, the money will simply just be a byproduct of those skills. And then what you do is that if you find that you cannot execute your plan, then you're going to have to get into a mode where you learn exactly how to do that, which is what we're going to get into later on. But the point is that what I recommend to people is that if they're having problems executing their trades, in most cases is because their position size is too large. In other words, once they learn that there's a specific regimen in which they can learn to be consistent. What they want to do is they want their cake and eat it too, sort of. In other words, they want to learn the techniques, but they don't want to cut themselves off from still making a lot of money. When the reality is they don't have the psychological skills to be able to execute trades based on the way they were trading before. So if they were a 5,000 share trader before, they'll set up these exercises that we're going to talk about later on in the afternoon with 5,000 shares, and then completely blow it and can't do it. The reality is their psychological makeup is such that they may only be able to do it flawlessly with 10 shares. So I work with people who had to go down to 1. To be able to execute it flawlessly, they had to go down to 1 share. And then they work their way up. Then they go to 2, and then they go to 5, they go to 10. They just work their way up. I mean, is there anybody in this room who hasn't paper traded? And is there anybody in the room who hasn't experienced being able to execute your trades flawlessly on paper? But then when you try to execute your plan with real money, it doesn't work. See, the plan's working, you're not working. This is what mechanical trading is all about, okay? Mechanical trading is finding out just how big that gap is. You cannot take for granted that because you recognize an opportunity to enrich yourself in some way, that you have the skills to be able to take advantage of it appropriately. You can't take it for granted. And most everybody does. So mechanical trading gives you all this information. It tells you what works and what doesn't in the market, and what works and what doesn't with you. So that you know what you need to focus on to be able to make consistent money. You guys with me on this? Yes. Is it making sense? Okay, then you can evolve, if you want, to the subjective stage of trading, because you can make consistent money trading mechanically. Okay, but most people like to be able to use their rational thinking and process and try to figure things out. And the subjective stage of trading is simply, this is a broader, more flexible mode of trading where you use everything you've ever learned about the price movement to determine your edges. In other words, all the different patterns you've learned, all the different nuances of market behavior will determine, where you get in, how much profit you take, where you set your stops. You see, in the subjective mode of trading, if someone said to me, okay, I'm buying here and my stop is here, but the market's starting to come down to my stop, and I get out right here and I don't let myself get stopped out at my original spot. Truly, for someone who's evolved to the subjective mode of trading, that's all right. You can do that because you're not doing it out of fear, and you're not doing it out of the fact that you haven't accepted the risk. You're doing it because you recognize the pattern that the market is giving you is such that there's a high probability you are going to get stopped out, and so therefore you might as well just scratch your trade or get out with a little bit of a loss. It's not because you're afraid. There's a huge difference. You guys with me on this? And then the last stage is the intuitive. This is the most advanced mode of trading. It would be the equivalent to getting a black belt in martial arts. It's when you find yourself in the zone, tapped into the collective consciousness of the market, giving you a sense of the flow. If you look at the market as being, a collection of individuals, you can tap into that. You can find yourself. It's not something you can will yourself into. You just find yourself in this zone where you're just seeing and doing things that you can't necessarily explain at a rational level. And the problem is that there are people. Everyone has intuitive capabilities. But some people it's completely shut off, and with others, they don't trust it because, they can't make the distinction between what's intuition and what's just their mind hoping that something's going to happen, or hoping that what they see is really what's going on, and making it feel like intuition. The problem is, until you acquire these fundamental skills that we're talking about, you definitely don't want to be trading based on intuitive impulses. You just want to make note of them. When you've got the skills and find yourself in the zone, then go ahead and do whatever comes to your brain until you flip yourself out of it. Meaning, when you start thinking at a rational level, you flip yourself right out of the zone, because your rational mind wants reasons. Your rational mind wants logical reasons, and these intuitive impulses don't come from that part of your brain. They come from that creative part of your brain. And by definition, creativity is bringing something forth that didn't previously exist. It may exist somewhere in the world or in the universe somewhere, but it didn't exist in your mind, and it's outside the parameters of what you already believe.
All right, so we're going to stop the video there. Thank you guys for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this part video that we have created. All right here for you. These are very intuitive things to think about, intuitive nature. Give yourself some grace. Like I said before, watch them over again if you need to. Hope you enjoyed this series. It's really a really telltale thing for that person who really desires to trade and to take these things serious. What you're doing right now is coaching yourself, motivating yourself, and gathering information to uniquely apply it to your trading career. That's why this is the Unique Trading Group. Your strategy meets mindset, and discipline turns into income. Thank you guys for watching. I appreciate your time. And until the next one, guys, peace.